What happens when a nation's wounds shape a killer, and even the law can't stop him? In late Soviet streets, violence carried elegance, mercy had a price, and a single name haunted three cities. One gun, many bodies, a trail of fire and fear. This is the last bandit of the Soviet Union, and the families who swore he would not escape justice. Happy, kind people are born in happy families. And happy families grow in places where dignity is protected, where tomorrow feels possible, and where the quiet rituals of life are not dictated by fear. But when a nation tears its own people from the soil they know, puts them on trains under guard, and scatters them into hostile lands, the first thing to die is certainty, then trust, then warmth. In the years of repression, entire communities were uprooted overnight. Grandparents and infants, newlyweds and sages, teachers and poets, shepherds and blacksmiths. Ordinary people thrust into extraordinary desolation, and when families fracture, something in the soul fractures with them. Sorrow becomes a daily language. And from that sorrow, too often, come not the kind, but the hardened. People bent by grief, sharpened by necessity, who learn to move through life like survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to anything that keeps them afloat. This story begins in the shadow of that inheritance. It isn't an excuse, it's a context. Because on these streets, at the end of the Soviet era, morality did not disappear. It split. On one side, the rituals of law, the brittle voice of authority. On the other, the quiet codes of men who lived outside it. Courtesy when it cost nothing, cruelty when it paid. In a country where power felt distant and justice felt delayed, a different order emerged. Part performative honor, part ruthless calculation. A man could fire into a ceiling to scare, call an ambulance for the victim, and then torch a house on another night without hesitation. A paradox wearing well-pressed clothes. When a nation reshapes fate by decree, some lives drift toward violence not by design, but by momentum. Small choices leading to large consequences, a series of edged moments where the easiest path is also the darkest. And in that dark, a figure takes shape. Elegant, disciplined, audacious. He studies habits, maps apartments, remembers faces, and leaves almost nothing behind, except bullets with a history and witnesses who cannot forget the eyes behind the gun. This is not a legend. This is a ledger of robberies that felt like theater, of murders that felt like verdicts, and of one man whose name turned up wherever the line between mercy and menace vanished, the last bandit of a dying empire, and the families who swore he would not escape justice. January 4th, 1989, a gray Siberian noon that feels more like midnight. Inside a modest party elite apartment, the curtains are drawn, the radiator ticks, and a district secretary sleeps the kind of sleep that follows a long night and a longer habit. The door latch kisses metal, soft, unhurried, and two men slide into the stillness like a draft under a threshold. They move as if the place belongs to them, a practiced quiet, drawers skimmed, jackets patted down, bills folded and tucked away. No rage, no rush, only purpose. They do not wake the man. They do not need to. This is a surgical visit, quick profit, clean exit, until the front lock grinds again and the line snaps. His wife pushes in with the practiced rhythm of return. Bag down, keys to the dish. And a small human sound escapes when she catches the shape in her hallway that should not be there. The sleeping official jerks awake, lurching from a fog into a scene already in motion. A glint of steel, a quiet warning. The reflexive hush of a man who has never had to be quiet in his own home. He sees the blade and chooses silence, the way men who trade in authority sometimes do when authority fails to arrive on time. The intruders leave with nothing but cash and a bruise on pride that will not fade. On paper, the secretary is a small king, first among equals in a district that still believes in ceremony. In private, he stares at his hands and feels something he rarely allows: humiliation. He does not pick up the phone to report a crime. He resolves to answer an insult, to settle it himself, to be the law he has spent a career announcing. That decision, quiet, solitary, made in the heat that follows fear, marks a turn in this story, Because the men who pass through his apartment are not drifters looking for a thrill. They are craftsmen of intrusion, apprentices of a different order, charting habits and testing gates, stepping through lives as if rehearsing for something larger. They leave behind more than missing money. They leave a template. Enter unseen, control the room, exit intact. They carry with them a message for anyone who listens closely enough. The door you trust may not hold. The rules you keep may not protect you. And somewhere beyond the walls and the winter light, the man who will one day be called the last bandit of the Soviet Union studies the effect of a small, controlled act. How terror travels without blood. How power softens when confronted by a whisper of violence. He learns that the cleanest wound is the one to a reputation. He learns there is currency in audacity, and he will spend it again and again until the city, the courts, and the families who bury their dead learn his name. In the months that followed, the same quiet choreography replayed in other homes. Doors tested, routines measured, fear introduced with the precision of a metronome. In Grozny, the Vatsuev family felt that rhythm at midnight. The mother understood the stakes and surrendered everything of value in a practiced gesture of self-preservation. That night, something strange cut through the dread. When an accomplice moved toward her daughter, the leader stopped him. Flat, final, a command that did not invite argument. The criminal world has its myths, and some of them are rules. Do not waste time. Do not stain the room without profit. Do not create a witness who cannot forget your face for the wrong reason. The story that surfaced afterwards sounded like mercy. In reality, it was management. The contradiction deepened the mystery. A man who moved with elegance, who preferred ceilings to chests when a shot would do, was playing at a kind of order. Return a bill to a pregnant woman. Call an ambulance for a man you just robbed. Rein in your partner when he mistakes cruelty for control. These gestures travel farther than gunfire. They build a reputation the way uniforms do. Instantly legible, hard to forget. In a country where official power spoke in decrees and arrived late, this was a different language of authority. Immediate, decisive, and, for as long as it served, curiously disciplined. But a code is not a conscience. It is a tool. The leader enforced limits not to restore dignity, but to choreograph fear. He knew how terror lingers when it is precise, and how witnesses talk when spared in a way that feels like judgment. To neighbors, he became a rumor in a well-cut coat. To victims, a paradox they could not quite name. To investigators, a pattern, a hand that preferred control to chaos, a gun that punctuated rooms rather than bodies, until it didn't. The line between performance and principle is thin in the underworld. The performance buys time. It softens testimonies. It confuses juries before they even assemble. It turns a predator into a man with rules. And in doing so, it tempts the mind to negotiate with him, if not for safety, then for sense. That temptation would be punished later in places where the ceiling was not enough and the fire did the rest. For now, the myth worked. The elegant intruder with the measured temper became a presence without a face, a voice that decided when terror ended. And anyone who mistook that voice for mercy had not yet seen what he did when the room would not bend. Beyond Moscow, in a quiet home where the night fell early and the walls held the hush of age, two men came for money and left with more than they intended. They left a sound that investigators would come to recognize. The sharp, controlled crack of a pistol fired not to kill, but to set the room on edge. Plaster dust drifted from the ceiling. A second shot clipped the wall, close enough to terrify, far enough to spare. The elderly owner clutched his chest and sank into a chair, struggling for breath while his wife gathered cash with trembling hands. The thieves took the bundle and vanished into the winter air, leaving behind only fear, two holes, and a man's heart laboring against time. What seemed like theater turned into evidence. When specialists arrived, they logged the angles of the rounds, photographed the spall, measured the spread. The recovered fragments told a story the intruders hadn't meant to tell. The weapon was Czech, Česká zbrojovka. Not a street relic passed among drunks, but a reliable instrument favored by men who prefer their outcomes to be predictable. To those who read ballistics the way priests read scripture, this was a signature, a mark of tradecraft. Then came the detail that felt like a dare. Minutes after the robbery, the pharmacy down the block received a call from a man with a steady voice and a precise request. Dispatch an ambulance to the address he had just bled of its savings. The staff remembered him. A high, thoughtful forehead, eyes with an unusual pitch to them, as if cut at a sharp angle. Polite, unhurried, a thief who sounded like a doctor giving instructions. The ambulance arrived, the old man lived, and the story of the considerate bandit thickened another layer. For detectives who had spent careers separating coincidence from pattern, the picture sharpened. A gun with a lineage, a shooter who calibrated fear to the millimeter, a habit of entering homes as if he'd already been there on paper, maps in his head, routines memorized, hiding places pre-guessed. He preferred certainty to chaos, control to carnage, but never mistook restraint for weakness. He was building something with these choices, a rhythm that victims could describe and police could chart, a brand in the language of violence. What none of them yet knew was how far that signature traveled. That same check bark would echo in other rooms, under other ceilings, linking crimes that felt distinct into a single advancing idea. It would lead investigators across oblast lines, through morgues and living rooms, to families who now measured their days by what came before and what followed the knock at the door. And as the file grew heavier, the man behind the muzzle refined his timing, learned which seconds to spend and which to save. He was not in a hurry, he was composing. The ceiling shots were the overture. The main movement had not yet begun. June 6, 1989. In the Rostov region, night sat heavy over a modest home at the edge of a quiet road. Two men arrived with the same studied economy that had become their calling card. No wasted motion, no raised voices, just the practical steps of a practiced intrusion. What began like any other robbery shifted quickly and irreversibly into something colder. The husband was shot. The wife was silenced by a rope and a pair of unflinching hands. There was no ceiling this time. No theatrical warning shot to corral fear into corners. Control, yes, but of a different sort. Efficient, final. Then came the fire. A match to erase the scene, to swallow fingerprints and footprints, to make truth a rumor and evidence a memory. Flames ran the rafters, swallowed curtains, breathed in oxygen, and breathed out black. In the heat's blind arithmetic, a baby, a year old, was left inside. When morning came, the house was a skeleton, and the story of restraint was ash. The funeral shook the district. Grief turned into something with edges, oaths whispered at gravesides, promises that if the courts failed to deliver the ultimate sentence, the families would. It wasn't bravado. It was a vow with a lineage in places where justice often arrives late or not at all. Investigators sifted through what the fire spared. Brass, fragments, trajectories born in muzzle flash and ended in char. Ballistics do what flame cannot, they remember. The casings and leads spoke the language the detectives had learned to hear. They linked Rostov to the earlier violence near Moscow and to another incident half a year before in Astrakhan. A couple attacked at 2 in the morning, shots delivered with the same mechanical steadiness. The bullet pulled from the woman's body was a familiar stamp, Cheska Zbrojovka. The overture had become a motif, haunting every crime scene like a chorus that would not be silenced. Neighbors remembered a man with a reporter's name who had asked questions days before the Astrakhan attack. Courteous, tall, self-assured, the way men with laminated identities sometimes are. The real reporter lived elsewhere and had a fresh credential to prove it. But witnesses did not forget the car. Numbers stick when fear presses them into the mind. Those numbers led to an owner, the owner to a driver, the driver to a name spoken for the record and under breath alike, Maduyev. The pattern was no longer rumor. It was a route, Siberia to Grozny, outskirts of Moscow to Rostov and Astrakhan, an itinerary of intrusion and escalation. The elegance people whispered about now had a counterpoint. Calculation without hesitation, arson in place of erasure, a baby reduced to a detail in a report that no one who read it would ever completely forget. The myth of the considerate bandit didn't break here. It revealed its limit, mercy when it served the design, murder when it did not. And behind both, the same steady hand, the same studied patience. A man who understood that fear is most durable when it arrives as certainty. The file thickened, the manhunt widened, and the cities learned to listen for the sound of a gun that left the same signature in rooms where the air never felt the same again. In Astrakhan, the violence arrived with manners. Days before a 2 a.m. attack left a couple bleeding on their kitchen tiles, a tall, well-spoken man introduced himself to neighbors as a reporter. Polite, inquisitive, the sort who writes notes with a tidy hand and leaves no reason for suspicion. He asked about routines, comings and goings, the basic rhythms of a street that sleeps early and wakes without fanfare. Surveillance dressed as conversation, reconnaissance passed off as curiosity. When the shots finally came, they carried the same mechanical certainty as before. Later, a surgeon lifted a bullet from a woman's body, and ballistics named the shooter's instrument without ever seeing his face. Cheska Zbrojovka. A calling card stamped in steel. The real journalist, whose name the imposter had borrowed, was at home, his new credentials freshly issued to replace a lost badge. That detail mattered. Impersonation had a limit. Paper trails, unlike aliases, are anchored to desks and signatures. But the neighbors remembered something far more useful than a name. A car with a number easy to recall, fear pressing the digits into memory the way a seal marks wax. Investigators traced the plate, and the chain tugged loose the first solid thread. An owner, then a driver, and finally a confession that didn't sound like a confession so much as a weary fact. The gunman with the polite voice and the decisive hands wasn't a shpak at all. He was a man whose name had already begun to echo from district to district, Ali Sergey Maduyev. A national alert followed, but what it really announced was a shift in tempo. Until now, the intrusions had felt like a traveling technique. Suddenly, they had a protagonist. The elegant stranger with the high forehead and unusual eyes was no longer a sketch. He was a file photo in the making, a dossier unfolding in real time. Witness accounts aligned. Tall, composed, unafraid of eye contact. Knew where valuables were kept before he crossed the threshold. Shot to control the room, ceilings, plaster, the occasional killing when control demanded it. Left behind little more than the kind of details that stay. A voice like an instruction, the silk of practiced patience, and a gun that told the same story in every city. That night in Astrakhan illustrated the architecture behind the crimes. Not improvisation, but stages. First, the mask. A reporter's name, a neighborly chat, a harmless smile. Second, the mapping. Routines cataloged, entries timed, escape routes rehearsed in the mind. Third, the act. A quiet breach, calibrated violence, a vanishing. And then, the ledger that only ballistics can keep. Lines connecting scenes that never met. Lives that never knew they shared a timeline. Families who would one day recognize themselves in a single narrative none of them asked to join. For investigators, this was the first true handle. Names are sharper than silhouettes. They cut through rumor and shorten distance. But names also provoke. A hunted man sheds caution differently once he hears himself circulating in briefings and watch orders. He changes weapons, changes cities, changes the music of his crimes. In Leningrad, the caliber will change, the myth will deepen, and the blood will come, as if to remind anyone fooled by elegance that the performance was never the point. Control was, and control, when challenged, answers without poetry. By autumn, the hunt crossed into Leningrad, and with the new city came a new sound. The crisp bark of the Cheska faded. In its place, the deeper, historical thud of a 7.62mm Nagant revolver. It was a deliberate pivot, part misdirection, part tradition. A weapon that felt as if it belonged to the city's stone courtyards and stairwells. The method, however, remained painfully familiar. A leader who entered like an invited guest, and an accomplice, young, volatile, who mistook aggression for control. Together, they made rooms obey. The robberies stacked up in a sequence that felt choreographed. Doors opened under a confident knock. Valuables appeared from their hiding places as if summoned. Shots punctuated ceilings with the precision of a metronome. Dust drifting like an hourglass turned on its side. The leader's presence rewrote the atmosphere of each apartment. Courtesy delivered on a razor's edge. Threats issued at a volume just above a whisper. The victims noticed details they could not forget. Well-pressed clothing, careful shoes, a voice that sounded like a decision already made. And then there was the contradiction that fueled the legend. In one apartment, after counting money, he returned a portion to a pregnant woman, as if the performance required a moment of grace to seal the memory. October 11th brought the pivot to blood. Anna Mikhailovna Yurik, elderly and stubborn against fear, tried to raise her voice at the wrong second. The leader fired. The round lodged and would later be pulled at a military academy, each millimeter telling the story of a revolver chosen to write in an older dialect of violence. That bullet joined a growing conversation among examiners, linkages forming like constellations across case files. Elegance had crossed its own boundary. If the earlier crimes suggested a man who managed rooms, Leningrad revealed a man who calibrated witnesses. Let them live when it built the myth. Remove them when the myth got in the way. Meanwhile, the accomplice, Slavic-looking, young, impulsive, served as a foil, a device the leader corrected and, when necessary, controlled. A pair that moved like a thesis in its argument. Police sketches multiplied. Patrol briefings ended with the same description. Officers stopped men who looked close enough and sent them home with apologies that sounded like warnings. The city learned to be afraid of footsteps in stairwells and the brief, polite knock that preceded intrusion. More telling than fear, though, was certainty. Whoever he was, he studied. He knew where jewelry slept, where cash hid, when a tenant returned from work, which windows watched the street, and which ones kept secrets. The new caliber told investigators as much about psychology as about ballistics. The Nagant was not an upgrade. It was a costume. It carried history and authority, the way a uniform does. It suggested someone who curated not just outcomes but optics, how the crime would feel in memory, how it would be told later. The elegant man with an old gun and modern nerve. By Winter's approach, the legend had acquired weight. The one with rules. The polite thief. The killer who returns money. Each name bent the truth toward comfort and away from the arithmetic of the dead. But comfort is a fragile thing. In a few weeks, a single act in a cafe would strip the euphemism away, leaving only the audience, the muzzle, and a question the entire room understood. Who wants to be next? In a modest neighborhood cafe, an atmosphere of routine and calm was shattered in an instant. The killer entered with the same deliberate composure witnesses had described from earlier crimes. Unhurried, polite even. But this time, terror was swift and absolute. He approached the 23-year-old doorman and shot him twice. First to incapacitate, then to finish. Without hesitation, he turned to the frightened patrons and coldly asked, "Anyone else?" The chilling question demanded silence, and he exited as quietly as he had arrived, blending back into the city's fabric. This brutal execution marked a turning point. Witnesses noting his calm mannerisms and the taxi he took left crucial clues. Police tracked the vehicle, discovering stolen items in the trunk, and the driver eventually named two suspects, Andrei Lvov and Roman. These names drew investigators southwards, toward Tashkent, where events escalated further. On the city's outskirts, a robbery quickly spiraled into violence. The homeowner, recently released from prison and armed with dangerous pride, confronted the intruders. Shots rang out. Roman, the accomplice, was mortally wounded, and a mother was caught in the crossfire. The tall leader took ruthless control, executing his injured partner to eliminate loose ends and seize important documents. This was no crime of passion. It was coldly calculated. Authorities later apprehended Lvov at the railway station as he purchased a train ticket to Moscow. During the search, he shocked officers by producing a grenade, which he armed with his teeth, forcing a tense standoff. Eventually, specialized forces intervened, and it was revealed that the grenade was a training device, a final act of defiance. The alias Lvov was discarded, exposing Ali Sergey Maduyev, a fugitive with a violent past spanning cities and crimes. Ballistic evidence linked his firearm to previous murders and robberies, including the bullet retrieved from victim Anna Yurik. The exhumation of Roman Chernyshev, the executed accomplice, solidified the manhunt's scope. This incident shattered the myth of the polite thief, revealing a killer who wielded fear as a weapon and controlled every facet of his violent empire. The chase was tightening, and for the first time the law was closing in. Sergey Alexandrovich Maduyev was no ordinary criminal. Born to a Chechen father and a Korean mother, his early life was shaped by exile, hardship, and fractured family ties. Raised between his mother and orphanages, with little guidance, he was almost predestined for a life on the wrong side of the law. But he didn't fade into the shadows like many lost youths. Instead, he became a master of his craft, an organized, highly professional bandit. Maduyev's contradictions made him unforgettable. He was charming, dressed sharply, and moved with confidence. He could be warm to children, thoughtful enough to return money to a pregnant robbery victim, and even call an ambulance for someone he had just robbed. These actions painted a strange picture. A man who created his own code of conduct in a country where official law was often absent or ignored. Yet beneath this veneer of civility rested ruthless violence. Maduyev was responsible for more than 60 crimes, robberies, murders, and arson, all carried out with calculated precision. He operated with a confidence fueled by a belief he would escape justice, signing interrogation records without reading them, eagerly naming accomplices while maintaining control over the investigation. His case fell to Leonid Proshkin, a senior investigator tasked with dismantling his network. Despite spending only 17 months free as an adult, Maduyev's criminal career was long and brutal. His victims ranged from innocent families to law enforcement officers. The woman of the District Communist Party secretary, who was victimized in Siberia, recognized him instantly during the investigation. Maduyev's arrogance led to several daring escape attempts, including one where he reportedly fired a shot during transfer and fled before being recaptured. His weapons were often modified or concealed, and at times the revolver's serial numbers were filed off to evade detection. Inside the prison system, few could imagine such a man controlled so much chaos. Under pressure, Maduyev named his accomplices, but also implicated corrupt officials. The investigation uncovered betrayal within law enforcement itself. Even a female investigator on the team, Natalia Vorontsova, was revealed to have aided Maduyev, driven by a complex mix of loyalty and desperation. Maduyev represents the last chapter of Soviet-era banditry, a relic of a violent, chaotic time struggling to survive in a changing world. His story is one of contradictions, cruelty and kindness, arrogance and vulnerability, order and chaos. The stage was set for judgment. Sergey Maduyev's criminal saga came to its climax in a trial that captivated a nation still wrestling with the collapse of old orders and rising chaos. The courtrooms of Moscow became the stage for a drama that was more than legal. It was symbolic. Here stood a man whose life embodied the fractured identity of a nation in transition, a man both feared and mythologized as the last bandit of the Soviet Union. The trial was lengthy and tumultuous. Maduyev faced charges for over 60 crimes, including murder, robbery, and arson. His defiant nature surfaced repeatedly. Attempts to escape custody, including a shocking moment when he fired a weapon during a transfer, shook the authorities. Twice more he tried to flee, once with a crudely fashioned pistol made of bread, and once with a real gun smuggled by a prison guard. Each attempt underscored his desperation for freedom and belief in his own invincibility. Despite the troubling details, Maduyev often appeared cool and calculated in court. He cooperated with investigators, providing names of accomplices and asserting control even as the walls closed in. But the families of victims demanded justice beyond cooperation. Relatives of the Shalomovs and Yurik attended proceedings, their presence a stark reminder of the human cost behind the headlines. The verdict was clear and uncompromising. Maduyev was sentenced to death, a sentence that reflected not just his crimes, but the desire to close a dark chapter in the nation's history. The state sought to make an example, both of the man and of the violent era he represented. But the story didn't end with a sentence. As the world changed outside the prison walls, so too did the nature of crime itself. Weapons became easier to obtain. Violence grew bolder and more unpredictable. Maduyev, once at the center of a web of fear and control, became a relic, a cautionary figure from a bygone time. His legacy is complex. A man who lived by his own rules, who demanded respect through violence and charm, who embodied the contradictions of a society in upheaval. The Last Bandit story is a reminder of how power, fear, and survival intertwine, and how justice, though delayed, strives to find its mark.